Born from a bomber, a machine too heavy and clumsy for the role of a hunter, it nonetheless became a weapon that the Germans dreaded by night and cursed by day. Its cannons tore apart aircraft with a single burst, and a magical mirror allowed it to see through the very darkness. But behind this success lay a grim statistic. More Beaufighter pilots died not in combat, but in accidents when the unforgiving machine made no allowance for mistakes. It accounted for tons of sunken convoys, burning liners, and destroyed superships. And all this was done by a plane that was initially predicted to fail. Why did the British risk throwing a crude fighter into battle? How could one burst turn the pride of the Luftwaffe into a flaming torch? And how did this machine manage to sink a giant liner, once considered unsinkable, into the sea? You'll find the answers to these questions below. And believe me, the end of this story will be a complete surprise to you. In the late 1930s, Britain lived with anxiety in its heart. In Germany, fists were being waved not only at rallies but also in the air. The Luftwaffe was growing at an incredible speed, and every new bomber regiment meant the threat of night raids on London. The British still remembered the scenes from the First World War, when giant zeppelins floated out of the darkness and dropped their cargo on the city with impunity. Back then, fighters simply couldn't gain enough altitude to intercept the enemy, and the capital was left defenseless. The Ministry of Aviation understood that a weapon was needed that wouldn't chase but would wait in the sky in advance. A machine with a long patrol time, capable of meeting a bomber on its approach. In 1937, a document with the number F3735 appeared. A dry line in a bureaucratic archive, but behind it lay a requirement for a completely new class of aircraft. The plane was expected to provide a simple and brutal solution. A single burst had to turn an enemy bomber into a blazing torch. 4 20mm cannons. That should have been enough to stop any threat. It all sounded logical on paper, but a question remained. Who and how would manage to create such a machine while the Germans were already practicing night raids on European cities? Great Britain realized there was almost no time left. Every week of delay meant new enemy bomber squadrons. And then, an engineer stepped onto the scene, ready to propose a solution that seemed risky but could save the country from disaster. At the Bristol factories, the twin-engine Beaufort naval bomber was already being built. The machine was intended for long-range patrols and attacks on ships, but by no means for night interceptions. And this is where engineer Leslie Fries made an unexpected move. Instead of years of developing a new fighter, he proposed turning what was already on the assembly line into a fighter. It was like going all in. Only the wings, tail section, and tail of the Beaufort remained, and he decided to radically re-engineer everything else. The crew was halved. Gunners and additional specialists were immediately eliminated, as the new aircraft was not intended for defensive combat. Instead of turrets and side machine guns, the nose section was equipped with the very thing the entire venture was about: a battery of 4 Hispano-automatic cannons. This concentrated firepower promised to destroy even the toughest German bombers in a single pass. The heart of the machine also changed. The old Taurus engines were replaced by more powerful Hercules engines with enlarged propellers. This required lengthening the landing gear struts and reshaping the engine nacelles. From the outside, the fighter looked a bit heavy. Its crude forms clearly revealed its bomber origins. But the idea behind it was simple: to quickly, cheaply, and as effectively as possible, turn a transport aircraft into a hunter. In the summer of 1939, the new aircraft, designated Type 152, took to the air for the first time. The test pilot was Cyril Ewens, and everyone expected the machine to show the very characteristics for which the whole gamble was conceived. The paperwork promised a top speed of 575 km/h, but reality was harsher. Without armor, armament, or extra systems, the prototype barely managed to reach 540 km/h. A second prototype, loaded with a full set of equipment, barely made it to 520 km/h. The numbers were disappointing. For a plane that was supposed to catch and destroy enemy bombers, every lost 10 km/h meant too much. However, the Ministry of Aviation didn't have the luxury of choice. Competitors from Hawker and Westland were bogged down in technical dead ends, and the threat of raids was getting closer. Great Britain understood it was better to have a crude fighter here and now than to wait for an ideal project that might be delayed for years. And so, The decision was made almost instantly. Bristol was paid for the prototypes they had already built and was immediately ordered to produce 300 series aircraft. The smell of gunpowder was in the air again, and there was no time to delay. The new fighter was named the Beaufighter, Beautiful Warrior, but seeing its massive silhouette, the nickname sounded more like a mockery. Only one question remained. Could this heavy machine prove that a real night predator was hidden behind its cumbersome outlines? With the start of the war, doubts about the new machine's suitability vanished instantly. The order for 300 fighters soon seemed like a drop in the ocean. The count went into the thousands. Britain was hastily expanding production. The Bristol factory in Filton couldn't handle the volume. The ferry company was brought in, and in Weston, the construction of a huge aircraft factory, ready to churn out Beaufighters on an industrial scale, was nearing completion. The first series aircraft began to roll out from there in February 1941. The first Beaufighters, with the designation MKYF, began to arrive in squadrons in the summer of 1940. These were still crude machines with unrefined systems, requiring constant modifications. But no one was waiting on the front line. The fighters were immediately thrown into action, as German bombers were looking for new targets over British cities every night. However, along with the increase in orders, a serious problem came to light. The powerful Hercules engines were in too high demand. Other types of aircraft also required them. There weren't enough factories, and the engines were distributed with a fight. The moment came when engineers had to consider, if the heart of the machine becomes a scarcity, can it be given another, less powerful, but more available one? And that's when the Beaufighter's story took a much riskier path. To save production from stopping, the engineers made a decision that many considered desperate. Instead of the usual Hercules engines, some of the aircraft were fitted with liquid-cooled Rolls-Royce Merlin 20 engines. It seemed that these engines should have breathed new life into the aircraft. They worked perfectly on Spitfires and Lancasters, but it was different for the Beaufighter. The machines with the new heart, designated MKIF, immediately showed a drop in performance. The speed fell to 485 km/h. The range decreased, the reliability declined, and the fighter, already considered difficult to handle, became even more capricious. As a result, British pilots were reluctant to accept such planes, and they were more often sent into battle with volunteers from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other countries who had found refuge in the Royal Air Force. This branch proved to be a dead end. Parallel production was soon shut down, leaving only the Hercules-powered machines in service. But the engineers learned one important lesson. If speed and maneuverability couldn't turn the Beaufighter into an exemplary fighter, perhaps its strength lay elsewhere. In the monstrous firepower it could concentrate in one short burst. If the Beaufighter lost to many in speed, it quickly became a champion in firepower. Even the basic battery of 4 Hispano cannons was impressive, but the engineers went further. Starting with the 51st series aircraft, Browning machine guns were added to the wings. 4 were placed in the right wing, 2 in the left, next to the landing light. As a result, there were 10 barrels on board, and a 1-second burst spewed 6.2 kilos of metal and explosives toward the enemy. This was a record among all fighters of the time, until the Americans introduced their P-61 Black Widow closer to the end of the war. However, such power came at a price. The first 400 machines were equipped with magazine-fed cannons. Each weapon had 4 drums, each holding 60 shells. When the ammunition ran out, the navigator had to manually change the magazine amidst the roar of battle and the bumps of the night sky. This was not only inconvenient, but also deadly. Lost seconds could cost the crew their lives. Later, the system was re-engineered for belt feeding, and the navigator was finally freed from the role of ammunition carrier. But the empty space in the cockpit didn't stay empty for long. In the autumn of 1940, he was given a new, much more complex and mysterious job. Now, at night, a device that changed the very nature of air combat was in the hands of the second crew member. In 1939, British engineers completed work on a device that seemed like science fiction, a compact airborne interception radar, or AI. It weighed more than 200 kilo, required a separate crew member, and took up a lot of space. But for the first time, it allowed a fighter to see a target in complete darkness and through clouds. Tests on the Blenheim bomber showed that the idea worked, and the choice fell on the Beaufighter as the ideal platform for the series installation of the radar. On September 8, 1940, the first machines with this magic mirror, as the pilots nicknamed the radar, were delivered to the 600th Air Defense Squadron. Initially, it was only for accelerated field trials, but very soon, all doubts were dispelled. On the night of November 19, 20, one of the crews did something that had recently seemed impossible. The radio operator spotted a target on the screen. The pilot flew the plane through the clouds, and the silhouette of a German Ju-88 appeared on the screen. Creeping up from behind, the fighter gave a short burst, and the heavy bomber disappeared into the darkness, leaving a flaming trail. In the morning, the wreckage was found near Wittering. This event became a turning point. Now, for the first time, British pilots could hunt at night not by chance, but guided by the precise readings of an instrument. And the more Beaufighters took to the sky with these stations, the more obvious it became. Night was no longer an ally of German bombers, but a new question arose. If the British had learned to see through the darkness, who would now become the best night predator? One of the first to unlock the potential of the radar-equipped Beaufighter was a young lieutenant, John Cunningham. His partner, Sergeant Operator Rounswell, kept his hand on the magic mirror while the pilot finished the attack. Night after night, this pair proved that new technologies could change the rules of war. In a short time, Cunningham shot down 9 German planes, and by the end of the war, his tally reached 20. The newspapers dubbed him the Cat's Eye Pilot, alluding to his ability to see where an ordinary person was powerless. A new tactic of night combat was born. It was no longer necessary to patrol blindly and hope for a chance encounter with the enemy. The radio operator would bring the target up on the screen, the pilot would get into position, and seconds would decide everything. German crews, who had recently been confident of the impunity of their raids, began to lose planes one by one. By the spring of 1941, 6 Beaufighter squadrons were operating in the British air defense, and the 1604th Squadron, under Cunningham's command alone, destroyed about 60 enemy aircraft in a few months. But the successes had a downside. To get into the elite night units, a pilot needed a massive amount of flight time, no less than 600 hours, dozens of training landings in the dark, and the ability to fly blind. Even for experienced aces, handling the heavy fighter remained a challenge. The Beaufighter was strict in its piloting, capricious, and required nerves of steel. Aviation accidents happened more often than combat losses. Meanwhile, the Germans were not going to give up the night without a fight. Their engineers were hastily developing their own systems of interceptors with radars, turning the sky into an arena for a new hunt, where hunters were now beginning to hunt hunters. When the Germans realized that the night sky no longer belonged to them, they began to equip their Bf-110s with airborne Liechtenstein radars. Now, in the darkness over Europe, not only bombers and fighters clashed, but entire pairs of hunters, capable of seeing each other through the clouds. Britain responded with an equally cunning move. The Beaufighters began to be equipped with the Serrate system, a receiver that picked up the signals of the enemy's radar. This allowed them to engage the enemy before they even noticed they were being tracked. Soon, the tactics of use changed. Beaufighters began to escort their own night bombers, protecting them from German interceptors. Real duels unfolded in complete darkness, where neither the moon nor the stars shone, only the fluctuations of the needles on the radar screens. A particularly vivid episode occurred in September 1943, when the 151st Squadron conducted a raid over Holland. That night, the Beaufighters shot down 13 Bf-110s, losing only 3 of their own planes. For the Germans, it was a shock. Their latest radars didn't help against an enemy who used their own emissions to home in on the target. But victories were getting harder to come by. The confrontation was clearly entering a new phase, and the old Beaufighter, despite its successes, was visibly losing out in speed and aerodynamics. To remain in service, it needed the next step forward, a major update of its design and equipment. The engineers at the Bristol Company did everything to extend the life of their heavy fighter. The Mk6 version became the pinnacle of the night Beaufighter's development. It was equipped with new Hercules Mk4 engines, which provided a little more power and allowed the machine to gain altitude faster. The stabilizers were given a V angle, which improved stability, and an elongated fairing for the new AI. She-8 radar with a parabolic antenna appeared in the nose. Now the crew saw targets farther and more accurately than ever before. In this form, the Beaufighter reached its ceiling. It remained a formidable opponent and could fight in the toughest conditions, but progress did not stand still. New, lighter, and more agile Mosquitoes were taking to the sky. Wooden fighters that combined speed, maneuverability, and range. They proved to be more suitable for the further development of the night air defense system, and they gradually began to displace the Beaufighters from combat units. By August 1944, the last MKVIFs were transferred to training units, but the departure from the night squadrons did not mean that the career of the beautiful warrior was over. On the contrary, a new, no less dangerous role awaited him as a hunter at sea, where the enemy was no longer aircraft, but ships and submarines. When the Beaufighters began to give way in night squadrons, their new fate was already sealed. The British Coastal Command Headquarters was urgently looking for a plane capable of patrolling coastal areas for hours and covering convoys from raids and submarine attacks. The Beaufighter was ideal for this role. A large fuel supply, powerful armament, and stability on long routes made it a valuable asset. Thus, the MKIC and MKI-4 versions appeared. Additional tanks were built into the wings to increase the range, sacrificing some of the machine gun armament. Now, the main task was not to intercept bombers, but to protect ships and conduct reconnaissance over the sea. From the end of 1940, these modifications began to enter the Coastal Command and immediately proved their effectiveness. They flew over the English Channel, the Atlantic, and the North Sea, wherever there was a threat from German submarines and strike groups. The new duties turned the Beaufighters into a kind of guardians at the boundary of water and sky. But soon the role of a guard became too small. The sea demanded not just cover, but a strike force capable of attacking enemy convoys right in the foam of the waves. And it was this evolution that gave this beautiful warrior its second, even more formidable incarnation. In the spring of 1942, one of the Coastal Command Beaufighters was fitted with a suspension for an aerial torpedo. The idea was risky. A heavy fighter was being turned into a naval strike aircraft, but tests showed that it worked. The torpedo hit the target accurately, and the speed and maneuverability of the machine gave it a chance to escape from anti-aircraft fire. Thus, the Torbeau, short for Torpedo Beaufighter, was born. To make it even more effective, designers replaced the engines with Hercules MKX, tuned for maximum thrust at the surface of the water. This solution was ideal for low-altitude attacks when the plane flew just above the crests of the waves. Later, underwing suspension points appeared on the Torbeau, allowing it to carry 500-pound bombs, or up to 8 rockets. A defensive turret with a machine gun was installed in the navigator's cockpit. Now the crew could cover the rear hemisphere. It was in the TFMKX version that the Beaufighter became a truly mass-produced naval torpedo fighter. It lost the look of a fighter and turned into a formidable assault platform capable of attacking almost any target at sea. At the same time, it remained the fastest torpedo bomber of the Second World War. All these innovations made the Torbeau a key player in the naval theaters of war, and now it had to prove its new purpose in battle, to see how these changes would perform under real fire over the sea. When the Torbeaus entered service, the British decided to change the very tactics of naval warfare. Thus, the strike wings appeared. Entire wings consisting of 3 squadrons of Beaufighters. Some carried torpedoes, others bombs and rockets, and a third provided fighter cover. Together, they turned into a swift fist, capable of destroying a naval convoy in a few minutes. In February 1943, the first of these wings went hunting over the North Sea. Their task was to freely attack any targets, from transport ships to destroyers. German sailors quickly felt that the usual routes no longer guaranteed safety. The raid on May 15, 1944, off the coast of Holland, was particularly noteworthy. The Torbeaus sank 2 transport ships of several thousand tons displacement, destroyed a minesweeper, and damaged 6 other vessels, and there were no losses. For the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine, this was a blow from which they took weeks to recover. The strike wing became a tool for constant pressure on the enemy. Now, German convoys went to sea as if under a gun, knowing that at any moment, dozens of low-flying Beaufighters could appear on the horizon. But the cold waters of the English Channel and the North Sea were only part of the story. Very soon, the Torbo was to move to where dark waves were replaced by bright sun and rocky shores in the Mediterranean, where the next chapter of its hunt would unfold. The Mediterranean Sea became a true arena of great victories for the Torbo. From bases on Malta and in Egypt, and then from airfields in southern Italy, these heavy machines began to methodically hunt for Italo-German convoys. Their strikes were lightning fast and merciless. A low approach over the water, a torpedo or a burst of rockets, and the ship would disappear in fire and smoke. On August 28, 1944, the Torbo caught up with the large Italian transport Giulio Cesare. Several accurate attacks turned it into a helpless target, and the vessel soon went to the bottom. But the episode 10 days later was even more resounding. The giant liner Rex, the pride of the Italian fleet, a record holder of the Atlantic, mobilized for military transport, was in the crosshairs. 8 Beaufighters attacked it with rockets. Of the 64 projectiles fired, 59 hit the target. The 51,000-ton liner was turned into a burning island. This strike became a symbol of how aviation is capable of destroying even the proudest symbols of naval power. The Mediterranean campaign proved the Torbo can handle any convoy, no matter how large. But while Europe was shuddering from blows on land and sea, another part of the planet was preparing to meet its own version of the beautiful warrior. There, where the war had a completely different character, under the scorching sun of the Pacific Ocean. When the war reached the Pacific Ocean, Australia found itself on the front line. There, they decided not just to accept the British Torbo, but to establish their own production. In the factory workshops of Fisherman's Bend, the Mk-21 variant appeared, the Australian interpretation of the beautiful warrior. These machines were noticeably different. Instead of 6 rifle-caliber machine guns in the wings, 4 large-caliber Colt Brownings were installed, capable of penetrating even armored ship hulls. A rectangular protrusion appeared on the fuselage in front of the pilot's cockpit. It housed the SRI autopilot, a novelty for its time, which made long flights easier. The Beaufighter Mk-21s were equipped with suspension points for rockets and bombs, as well as a defensive turret covering the tail. The first aircraft took to the air in May 1944. And by the end of the war, the Royal Australian Air Force had received 365 such machines. They flew over the islands of the Pacific, operated against Japanese convoys, and struck fortifications on the coasts and in the jungles. For the crews, it was a reliable and harsh partner that knew how to take a punch and respond with force. But the calendar relentlessly moved towards September 1945. The war was ending, and with it, the Beaufighter's path as a frontline weapon was coming to a close. Now, a new question arose. What would happen to the beautiful warrior in a world where silence would once again reign over fields and seas? A total of 6,299 Beaufighters of all modifications were built during the war. But such an impressive number did not save it from a swift departure from the stage. In the first post-war years, most of the machines were sent to the scrap heap. New projects displaced the heavy fighter, created for the specific tasks of the war. A few countries still decided to give it a second life. Turkey acquired 24 machines, Portugal received 16, and the Dominican Republic 10, and they were used until the mid-1960s. An even more unusual story occurred in the Middle East. Israel managed to secretly acquire 5 Beaufighters even before its official recognition of independence. One crashed en route, and the others perished in the battles of the First Arab-Israeli War. In Britain, some of the aircraft were converted into target tugs for aerial targets. With their help, anti-aircraft gun crews were trained. For the formidable Torbo, this was a modest, almost mundane role, but it extended the life of some examples. Only 2 original TF-MKXs have survived to this day. One is stored at the Royal Air Force Museum in Hendon, the other at the National Museum of Canada. They stand there as silent witnesses to an era when design boldness and a willingness to take risks made it possible to turn a naval bomber into a universal hunter in the shortest possible time. The story of the Beaufighter is a story of flexibility of thought, It was born as a compromise, grew cannons and radars, turned into a night killer, then a naval guardian, and finally, a torpedo bomber. Each new incarnation was dictated by the war, and each made it a crucial player of its time. It was this ability to be reborn that decided the outcome of many nights in the British skies and on the high seas. The beautiful warrior proved that even the most cumbersome outlines can hide a weapon that changes the course of history.